Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I'm going to talk about the death of comics once again, but I'm going to have a little ray of hope at the end of this tunnel because I did that video, my last video, where I talked about Disney being the death of Marvel Comics, and a lot of people said, I can't fault you for what you said, but that's really negative. And it was really negative because I wanted to put this little ray of hope at the end, but the video was just too long as it was, so I'm going to do this separate video about that little ray of hope. But I have to start from that negative place again and work my way towards that ray of hope. So in my last video, I talked about the fact that people who create comics, people who sell comics, a lot of people out there who have an interest in this industry are starting to admit that something is wrong, and something is terribly wrong with comics. You have owners of comic shop chains saying that 95% of what they get actually becomes worthless if it doesn't sell within the first week. And you have the industry itself saying, look, we made more money than last year, but the only reason they made more money, if you look at the numbers, is they sold less comics, but they actually jacked up the price of the comics that they were selling. And that's not a healthy industry. That's a sick and dying industry. So first we have to ask the question, why is the industry dying? Now, most people would probably say that the industry is dying because SJWs took over the comic book industry and they have just promoted garbage, and that's why it is dying. Now, I will say that I don't believe that that's actually the case. I think your SJWs and their takeover of comics is actually just a symptom of a much larger problem. So let's ask the question, how in the world did the SJWs take over the comics to begin with? Well, most people usually go down this path and say what they did was they took over the message boards for comics in the early 2000s, and they made it look like everybody who was actually commenting on comics and read comics were just SJW-minded people, and they presented that to the people who actually produce comics, and they said, this is your audience. Look, you should hire us and people like this in order to produce comics for these people. And so they got into the comic industry and then again promoted only people who thought like they did and took over the entire industry. And that's actually a socialist tactic called the Long March through the institutions, which they use to take over institutions which they can find useful to their cause. Now, I would say, yes, that's actually what happened. But I think you have to look at the question, why did it happen? Or how was it allowed to happen? That is the more important question. So to answer that question, I want to extend the analogy of comics being a dying man. I want to extend that analogy because, yes, comics are dying. It's like a dying man. And to extend that analogy, it's like a person who has gone to the hospital to die, like an older person. Sometimes older people, they've just lived so long that they go to the hospital and they know they're going to die because their body is starting to shut down. And one of those things that usually shuts down in their body is their immune system. And when their immune system shuts down, then they catch every disease, every bug that comes across their path. And that's what happens, and it usually speeds up their death. Now, I think this is why SJWs actually took over comics, because the immune system for comics was just obliterated before they actually got there. And they, the disease, just took over because there was no immune system for comics. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I saw this SJW-ism, this kind of thinking in comics as early as the late 1990s. I saw it sticking its head up at that time. But it didn't take over because it was still a little bit of a healthy industry. It still had some health to it. But there became a point where, again, this immune system for comics broke down and they simply took over. And they're just going to speed up the death of this industry. So what happened, I would say, goes all the way back to the 1990s, goes back to the late 90s when Marvel went bankrupt and they had to be bought out by a larger company. And at that point, something happened. Because they had gotten so big, they were bought out by a larger company, which then tried to use them to sell other products. That's really what happened. And it went through a bunch of different phases, and it ended up with Disney and the movies. And I'm going to talk about it in that form because that's the one that people are probably most familiar with. But that's really what happened. Comics started at that time and have got to this point now where they are no longer a medium actually about entertaining people through the genre of comics. That's not what comics are for anymore. Comics are for something else. They're to draw you into another medium of entertainment where the people who own the large companies can actually get you to spend much, much more money, like the movies, like television. That's what the comics are for. And you can see it if you look at the comics, how exactly, especially in Marvel, how exactly your comic universe is being shaped in order to mimic what the movies look like, what they sound like, how they're structured. And this is so that they take people from the comics and shove them towards the movies, towards these big money makers. You know, you can see it in the visual. You can see characters looking like they do in the movies. You can see teams being structured like they are in the movies. Not ever structured that way in the comics, but it's now been altered in the comics. They have altered the comic universe to reflect the movies. You can see things like, I would say, this new series that's coming out, Meet the Skrulls. They're going to revamp the entire structure of the way you see the Skrulls in the Marvel comic universe in order to prep you for the Captain Marvel movie. They're using comics not as an entertainment vehicle in themselves, but in order to draw you into a bigger entertainment structure of the movies and television. And that's what has happened over the last 20 years. Because, as I said in my last video, Black Panther made more money, that one movie made more money for Disney than the entire comic industry put together in the previous year. So comics really don't make a whole lot of money. So they're simply using the comics in order to pull people into a larger medium where they can make more money than the comics ever can make. And it was this misuse of the body of comics that actually began the degradation and the destruction of this industry. This misuse of the body is what happened, and you can only abuse a body so much, you can only misuse it so much before it starts to break down. Because that's what happened. The immune system for comics broke down. And it broke down quite specifically because they're concentrating on these larger venues. They don't care if SJWs take over comics. I don't think it was a planned thing for comics to actually go in this direction. I think it was, we simply don't care if it gets destroyed, because these companies are simply using comics for a purpose other than what they are actually created for. And in using them and abusing it for that purpose, it really didn't care what happened to that industry at all. And you can see this not just with Marvel, but also with DC. The same thing happened with DC. It got gobbled up by this large corporation, and it started pouring all of its characters and all of its money into producing television. You had 10 years worth of Smallville and all of these other smaller shows that you had all over the place. Now, they haven't had as big a success as Marvel with the movies, but they had a great success with the television shows. And again, their comics were something that was used to draw people into these larger venues of entertainment. And it's not just the big two either. You can see it with the smaller companies like IDW. Over a year ago, they borrowed $10 million in order to produce a television show for Netflix based upon their characters. And they had to eat that cost because of what actually happened. And now they have to borrow tens of millions of more dollars in order to stay afloat. And the problem here, again, is they're abusing the system of comics. They're using it for something other than it was meant for in order to draw you into a larger medium of entertainment. And in doing so, they're just destroying that medium by misusing it for something that it's not actually supposed to be used for. And again, it's not just the comic companies either. It's also now the comic creators. You have all of these people working for Marvel, who Marvel specifically went out and said, hey, how would you like to work for Marvel? These are people who write things like YA novels. If Marvel had never come to them and said, hey, do you want to write comics? They would probably have gone on their merry way and never actually come into contact with comics at all. They would not be comic book writers, nor would they ever think of becoming comic book writers. They are comic book writers now, and it seems like when they give interviews, they are a little bit impressed with themselves that they're writing comics, but you can also tell that they're not going to be around very long. They're just using comics because they're the big thing now, and then they're going to leave. And you also have people at the same time coming into comics who never have written anything before, and they're just using them because they think that, well, I'm going to write these comics now, but eventually I might actually get to write an episode of Gotham, and then maybe I can write a movie after that, and therefore I'm just climbing the ladder. And comics are just the first rung on this ladder. And again, they're just using comics to climb to higher mediums. So it's not just the companies, it's also the people who work for these companies, who are misusing comics, misusing the genre of comics in order to get something other than a good comic. And as I said, this misuse of the genre of comics is what made it unhealthy to begin with. And since their misuse of the genre of comics actually led them to get a lot of money, then they just turned their backs on it and didn't want to defend it against anything like its takeover by SJWs. That's simply, in my opinion, what happened. So where is the ray of hope at the end of this? Well, the ray of hope is actually, I would say, going to take a little bit of suffering, and that is the fact that comics are going to die. In their present form, they are simply going to die. Why? Because the movies are not going to last forever. The television shows are not going to last forever. We all know that television and movies go through cycles, and nobody produces westerns anymore because nobody wants to see westerns anymore. Nobody produces buddy cop movies anymore because nobody wants to see buddy cop movies anymore. Nobody produces vampire movies really anymore because people have moved on. And nobody produces zombie movies or zombie shows really anymore. There's still some hangers on, but really people are moving on. And there's going to come a point where people are going to simply move on from comic book shows and comic book movies and say, okay, we're done with that. And when that large pot of money is gone, when that medicine to help that dying man stay alive is gone, then the man is going to die. Then comics in their present form are going to die. And the ray of hope is this: there will always be comics because there is a specific subculture that is built around comics. There are people who love comics, and there are people who will always consume comics because we are out there. And the point is that in order to produce these comics after this current form of comics have died, the people who are going to run the companies, the people who are going to produce the comics, they're actually going to do so at a loss. And that's how comics were for a long time. Now, they're going to have to keep their head above water, of course, but they're going to do it not because they want to get into something else, not because they're going to make a giant pot of money off of television, not because they're going to make a giant pot of money off merchandise or movies or anything else. They're actually going to produce these things at some sort of a loss to their person, that is to say, personal loss, because they love comics so much that they're willing to give up any other future of writing books or novels or television shows or anything else. They'll say to themselves, I want to write comics. I love comics so much. I could go write a novel, but I don't want to. I want to write comics. And that's all I want to do because I love comics. And you'll have producers and owners of the company saying the same thing. I know this company isn't as big as a lot of other companies and never will be, but I love comics, and that's why I'm doing this. And they're going to have to be self-sacrificial in producing comics, in owning comic industries. And there's your ray of hope right there. Because, we should try to get rid of this SJW horde that is controlling comics. I'm certainly going to still do videos about such things. But at the same time, in knowing that the movies are eventually going to become passé and people are no longer going to see them, then the comics are going to die. These people who now run comics, these SJW people who run comics, will also die out with that dying of this current form of comics. They simply will. Because if the companies have to start again, if the genre has to start again, with that self-sacrificial bunch of guys working in a basement or some little place next to a Pizza Hut and putting out comics from their little studio, these are self-sacrificial people. And if there is one thing that SJWs are not, it is self-sacrificial. If there is something that their little ideology is built on, it's self-aggrandizement. And that's it. That's why they're there to begin with now, because comics are something that is in, and they want to be in control of what is in. But as soon as they have to become self-sacrificial in order to actually produce comics and to be a part of this industry, they will flee away from it like rats from a sinking ship, and they will no longer concern themselves with it at all. And I, for one, certainly will feel bad if I never get to see some of my heroes again, but I will feel good when comics in their current form die, because I know that the rebirth that will eventually come out of comics will bring comics back to a genre where people produce comic entertainment because they want to, because they love it, because they love the genre of comics, because it's for building up the genre of comics, and only building up the genre of comics. That it may be used for something else someday, but that's not their concern. They simply love comics enough so that they will sacrifice some of what they have to do in their life in order to produce these beautiful things which we all love. And as I said, I look forward to that day, because honestly, I don't think it's too far away. So there's my little ray of hope. Hopefully, it's a little ray of hope for you as well. If it is, hit like. Hit the shield in the lower right hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me whether or not you think this is enough of a ray of hope to get you to continue to read comics. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.